So for this part of the look def bit, I've still got my one object selected from the last video. I've got all these modifiers applied, and I want to talk about shading very quickly. Now I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to create a really awesome shader, but what I wanted to show you is how to use these shaders combined with your modifiers and how you can do really interesting things. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to create a quick brick texture as an example, and give it a second to load in. Then I'm going to hit Control T with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled to use my UVs. And this is something really important because I set up these UVs in the previous video. And because I set up the regular UV first, this is the one that your material is going to use. But you could, if you hit the input here, go to UV map and use whichever one you want. But that way you have one nicely unwrapped version of it, or in my case, a smart UV projected version of it, which obviously it's not the best unwrap, but it does the job for now. And the cool thing is that now we have something we can work with. So we have two UVs, one for our shader and one for our effect. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set these to white, crank up the size a little bit, which will in turn actually make it smaller, change the offset. I'm going to approximate what I had in the final video so you can kind of see how I got there and how I do things. So I like using the brick texture for sort of nice square patterns, and you can mess with the size of these as you're working with them. And by using the mortar size and bringing this up, we can get some really cool results. There we go. Something like this, maybe just a touch smaller. And if we add a math node in here, we can add that color in, set this to multiply, and pop this into our displacement, which means we will have a nice little displacement going on. Now, actually, in this case, I'm doing it the inverted way. These little dots are actually sticking out because they're white. So what you could do is just switch this around and bring the mortar size to white, which in turn just makes it a texture that looks like this. So that means all of the black portions are going to be pushed into the mesh, and all of the white portions are going to be like on the surface. So if I go back to my diffuse, now I could change the size of the mortar a little bit, and there we go. We get sort of a similar looking result. And by using just a very simple multiply node, I'm not actually using subdivision or micropolygon displacement, sorry. I'm just using the regular displacement as a bump map. Now we can dial in the value to whatever we want, and we won't get as extreme a result. There we go. We get something similar. I think in the end, I dialed this down to a very, very low setting, so you can just barely see them. So with that done, next thing I want to do is add in my reflections. So I'm just going to add in a mix shader, add in a glossy shader, and then mix them together using a layer weight shader. So some people still tend to use the Fresnel shader. As far as I understand, this is actually more used for refractive shaders rather than reflective shaders, and the layer weight one is the more optimal one to use for a surface shader that doesn't deal with any refractions or anything like that. There we go. Set the blend down a little bit, bring the roughness down of the shader a bit. And as you can see, this is a really nice way of working because I've just set my viewport to rendered. I haven't left this UI set up, and I can just keep iterating and keep iterating. This is something I really love about doing this type of work in Blender. It gives you a lot of flexibility. So I'm going to go back a couple of frames. See somewhere where we can see the there we go. We can see the wireframe a little better. Now this wireframe is still set to a very extreme level, and I would go back in and tweak my mask a little bit that we did in the previous video. Maybe separate these out a little bit more so the in the final shot, I believe, the effect is a little bit more gradual. But the reason I wanted to show the shading in combo with the modifiers is in most of the modifiers, like wireframe, I think the bevel one, and solidify, there's a bunch of modifiers that actually have this material offset. And this is a really cool thing because if I set this material offset to 1, what I can do is I can add a second material onto my object, which maybe has a completely different color. In this case, it's white. It's going to turn it black really quickly so we can see exactly what's going on. And that way our material of our wireframe can be something completely different. So you can have really, really interesting effects shading effects at least, that affect only certain parts of your mesh. So if I were to change this to maybe a glass shader, I have no idea what this is going to look like, but bring the color back up again. And you can see you can have this really interesting effect going on with just the wireframe being affected. So that's why I wanted to show shading combined with this technique, because it's really cool. I mean, you can do all kinds of crazy things with this. And again, your imagination is pretty much the limit. So I hope this showed a little bit how I use these modifiers to affect my shading as well, and some of the basics of shading. I guess I might do a technique video that has a little bit more sort of advanced shading techniques in it as well. So, all right, that's it for this video.